The wind screams across the desert floor like something alive and desperate, kicking up dust clouds so thick you can't see more than 10 feet ahead of your own boots. It is the kind of storm that swallows wagons whole and leaves no trace of them behind. And with the sun dropping fast, the temperature has already started its lethal plunge. That is when you see her. She has collapsed against a rock formation the color of dried blood, her body slumped in a way that suggests she simply ran out of life. Her kimono is a faded indigo silk that must have cost someone real money once, but now it is soaked through with sweat and clinging to her frame. Her jet black hair has come loose and sits matted flat against her face, tangled with grit and a dark smear of blood from where she hit the ground. She isn't moving or showing any signs of consciousness, and for a long moment it looks like she isn't even breathing. Then her lips move. Barely audible over the howling wind, she whispers words in a language you don't recognize, repeating the same Japanese phrase over and over as her voice cracks lower with every breath. It is a prayer, recognizable by that universal rhythm of someone calling out to a higher power because they have absolutely nothing else left to hold on to. She was left out here to die, and the man who finds her is about to change everything. 2 hours earlier, she had woken up in the back of a trading post wagon expecting to hear the men loading supplies for the day ahead. Instead, she found nothing but empty space where they had been sleeping, and the sound of canvas flapping uselessly in the wind. The wheel ruts headed south toward the nearest town, and since those wheels belonged to the very wagon she was sitting in, she realized they had unhitched the team and vanished. There were no horses, no men, and most importantly, there was no water left behind for her. That was the moment the truth hit her as clean and sudden as a knife, and she knew with terrifying certainty that they were never coming back. Her name was Akiko, though the men who brought her west had stopped using it months ago in favor of a contract number written in ledgers she couldn't even read. She was nothing more than cargo to them, and she had been treated that way since the day they pulled her off the San Francisco docks and pointed her toward the harsh interior of the country. Her kimono had been a vibrant indigo silk once, serving as a wedding gift from her mother on the day she married a man she had never actually met. That silk had been beautiful when she first put it on, but now it hung loose and faded, torn at the seams where she had caught it on wagon wheels and rough wooden planks. Her tabby socks were ripped at the heel and she had no shoes, which meant her feet were already covered in blisters from 2 days of desperate walking. The desert stretched out in every direction without the mercy of rolling hills or distant mountains to break up the horizon. It was just flat, cracked hardpan that shimmered in the heat like a living thing waiting for her to fail, and she had no map, no English, and only 37 cents in American currency that she didn't know how to use. She started walking because staying still meant dying faster, and she refused to give up without a fight. The sun moved across the sky like a clock with a single purpose, slowly counting down the hours until the dark would claim her. Her feet began to leave small spots of blood in the dust. Her throat felt like it was filled with dry sand, and every breath burned her lungs as if she were inhaling fire instead of air. The hallucinations started around the 4th hour when she began seeing water that vanished the moment she reached for it, and she even saw her mother standing in the shade of a rock, whispering things Akiko couldn't quite understand. By the time evening arrived and the temperature started to drop, her voice had completely failed her, but her body kept moving through sheer muscle memory. It was the kind of movement that doesn't require a conscious mind, driven only by basic instinct and the rhythm of a quiet prayer. She eventually found a rock formation with a small overhang and collapsed into the cooling shadow, which is where she started reciting the Buddhist prayer her mother had taught her. It wasn't a plea for salvation or a miracle, but rather a request for the strength to make it through the night and find just one more breath. The wind carried that prayer upward toward the high ridges drifting into the high country where men go when they want the rest of the world to forget they exist. Ezra's cabin sits on a high ridge overlooking the valley, and from that height you can see everything that matters, which happens to be absolutely nothing. He had spent 3 winters up there alone, watching the smoke curl from his chimney while the world stayed away. The people in the town below had learned early on that coming up the ridge to look for him was a mistake. The cabin was a basic one-room setup with a fireplace, a bed he rarely bothered to use, and a single chair that faced out toward the window. A rifle hung on hooks above the door, and supplies like dried meat, canned goods, and coffee grounds were stacked along the walls. It was everything a man needed to ensure he didn't need anything else from anyone. Ezra was in his mid-40s and looked weathered the way men do when they live outdoors, but stopped caring about their reflection around the second year of solitude. His salt-colored hair was tied back in a loose knot, and his beard had grown thick and unkempt over the seasons. The first thing you would notice was the scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawbone, a wide and puckered line that didn't come from an accident or old age. That kind of mark only comes from a moment of extreme violence. His hands told a similar story because the knuckles were thick and shaped wrong, looking like they had been broken and reset more times than a person should ever have to endure. His palms were calloused so deeply that the lines looked like they had been carved into the skin with a knife. These were the hands of a man who had spent his life breaking things or breaking people until he finally broke himself enough to walk away. He never talked about why he chose the ridge, and the townspeople never asked, which was the foundation of their unspoken agreement. The rule was that if they didn't come up the ridge, he wouldn't come down. And for 3 years, that simple arrangement had worked out just fine. Everything changed when the wind shifted. He was standing outside restacking his firewood when he heard a voice thin and distant, right in the breeze from somewhere deep in the desert. It wasn't English or anything he recognized, but it was human, and the desperation in the sound made his body go rigid without his permission. His first thought was a practiced one, telling himself it wasn't his problem because he had built 3 years of peace on that single rule. He told himself not to go down and not to get involved because letting the world below touch his life would ruin everything he had worked to build. He turned his back and went back to stacking the wood. The voice didn't stop, though, and it kept drifting up the ridge with the same words repeated over and over again. There was a specific rhythm to it, and the way each repetition got quieter told him the person was running out of air and was very close to dying. He stood there for 2 minutes while he tried to convince himself that it wasn't his business and that the town had a doctor who could handle it. But the town was to the south while this voice was coming from the desert to the west, which meant the person was far beyond the reach of anyone else. Ezra grabbed his coat before he even realized he had made a choice, his body moving with a muscle memory from the days before he had learned how to stay still. He was halfway down the ridge before he could think it through, moving so fast that the loose stones under his boots barely had time to slow him down. The descent took 20 minutes, which was just enough time to realize he was about to change the very thing he had spent 3 years trying to keep broken. He found her collapsed against a rock formation that looked like a relic from the first morning of the world. Her silk kimono was soaked through with sweat and grit, and her black hair was matted flat against her head, tangled with dust and a streak of blood where she had struck the stone. Her eyes were half closed with the whites showing, and the only part of her that was moving was her lips. She was still praying. Ezra knelt down slowly, but she didn't react because she was too far gone to even register that another human being was standing over her. When he got close, he could feel the fever heat radiating off her skin, which was pale and clearly unpracticed with the harsh desert sun. Her hands were soft and looked entirely wrong for a place as brutal as this. He spoke quietly, telling her she was going to be okay and that he wasn't going to hurt her. She didn't understand a word he said, but she pulled her hands up to cover her face, and he could feel the terror coming off her like a physical weight. He wrapped her in his heavy coat and realized she was much lighter than she should have been, almost as if she had been burning away from the inside for days. The climb back up the ridge took much longer than the trip down because her body was dead weight in his arms. It was a mercy that she had passed out because it meant she didn't have to feel the struggle of the ascent. Once they were inside the cabin, he laid her on the only bed he had and immediately started building up the fire. The room filled with warmth quickly, and he brought over water and a cloth to wash the dust from her face as carefully as if he were handling something that might shatter. Her eyes suddenly fluttered open, and when she saw him, she tried to scramble backward into the headboard with her mouth open and to let out a scream. He held his palms up flat to show he wasn't a threat and told her to take it easy. She didn't understand him and began speaking rapid Japanese, her voice sounding hoarse and broken as the words tumbled over each other like stones falling down a hill. He pointed to his own chest and said his name was Ezra. She just stared at him with eyes that were wide and dark, filled with nothing but pure fear. He pointed to her, and she whispered something in her own language that he couldn't quite catch. He repeated the sound back to her, mangling every syllable and getting the inflection wrong in every possible way. She almost laughed then, a sharp and surprised sound that made it seem like she wasn't entirely sure if she was allowed to. She woke sometime after midnight to a cabin that had fallen into deep shadow, and the only light came from the fireplace where the wood had burned down to a pile of orange-red coals. For a long moment she had no idea where she was, because the ceiling above her was made of rough-hewn timber rather than the canvas she expected. The bed beneath her felt solid and real, with a frame and a mattress and heavy blankets that carried the scent of tobacco and sun-dried cloth. Panic flooded her chest for a second because she couldn't remember how she'd arrived in this place. But then she saw him. Ezra was sitting in the chair by the fire with his head tilted back in sleep, and a rifle lay across his lap like a second bone. His breathing was deep and even, and in the stillness, he looked much less threatening than he had before. He was just an older man with a scarred face and calloused hands that looked worn down by seeming time alone couldn't explain. She lay perfectly still while she watched him, trying to decide if she should run or stay, but she noticed her feet were carefully bandaged and her throat felt less raw. Whatever had happened while she was unconscious, it was clear he hadn't tried to hurt her. She moved as slowly and carefully as if she were wading through deep water and climbed out of the bed, though her legs felt weak and shaky. She kept one hand pressed against the wall to test her balance, but he didn't stir from his sleep. The cabin was small enough to cross in 10 steps, and she soon found his kitchen area, which consisted of a cast iron stove and a few shelves holding dried meat and canned goods. On the lower shelf behind a tin of coffee, she found something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a small wooden box, and inside were dried herbs and roots and bark that she recognized instantly. There was dark, gnarled ginger root and dried mugwort alongside something that looked like the angelica her mother used for favors. Her hands trembled as she lifted each piece because these were Campo medicines. And you didn't find things like this in a mountain cabin unless someone knew exactly what they were doing. You awake? She spun around to find Ezra watching her from the chair, his eyes open but showing no signs of anger. He pointed toward the herbs and asked a question she didn't understand, but the curiosity in his tone was unmistakable. She nodded quickly and held up the ginger, gesturing first to a raw throat and then to a cup on the shelf. He understood the silent request and pointed toward the stove with a nod. She moved to take over the kitchen, and he let her, lifting his hands off the rifle so they stayed visible and non-threatening. Her hands moved with a sense of purpose for the first time since he'd found her, as she filled the cup with water and set it on the heat. While the water warmed, she pulled out 3 pieces of ginger root and crushed them against the rim of the cup with the base of a spoon to release the oils. She found a jar of honey and added a spoonful, steeping the medicine until the liquid turned a pale, clear amber. The cabin filled with a sharp, clean smell that felt like honest medicine, and she handed the cup to him. He drank it without any hesitation or doubt, and that single act of trust, A stranger, taking what she had made, shifted the air between them. She could see the realization in his face that she wasn't helpless, and he seemed to understand that he didn't need to be afraid of her either. When he finished the drink, he gave her a short nod of acknowledgement, and she sat down across from him by the fire. They didn't speak as the night settled around them, and neither of them felt the need to reach for words that weren't there. The flames crackled while the wind moved through the pines outside, and two people who didn't share a language realized that survival didn't need a translation. The first snow arrived in late September and coated the ridge in a layer of white that refused to melt. By the time October rolled around, the cabin didn't feel like a refuge anymore, and it started to feel more like a cell they had chosen for themselves. The days began to blur into weeks, and while the language barrier didn't exactly disappear, the way they communicated started to shift. She would point at an object, and he would say the word in English, which she would then repeat while mangling the consonants. He would laugh, a sound he hadn't made in 3 years. And then he would try to say the word her way. They were building a bridge out of broken sentences and hand gestures. She taught him the Japanese names for the herbs she used, and in return, he taught her the names of his tools: nada, hammer, kurgan, iron. Her accent was always careful and precise, but his Japanese sounded like a man trying to speak backward. Still, they kept at it every day, filling the long silences with words that mattered and plenty of words that didn't. One morning in early November, she found him outside trying to cut wood for their winter supply, but his hands were a complete mess of broken blisters and raw, split skin. He was favoring his right side and moving much slower than usual, so she didn't bother asking for permission to help. She walked straight up to him and took his hands in hers to examine the damage without saying a word. His palms were thick with old calluses, but an infection was clearly starting to set in under the skin. She could feel the heat rising off his palms and saw the red streaks beginning to creep up toward his wrists. Once they were inside, she tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her indigo kimono, which had already lost most of its dignity to this harsh mountain life. She spent 20 minutes preparing a poultice from ginger, mugwort, and a supply of yomogi she had gathered. She heated the herbs with water and oil before crushing them into a thick paste and wrapping his hands with a methodical care that suggested she'd been doing this her entire life. He didn't argue with her and simply sat there and let her work. Within 3 days, the infection had cleared up entirely, and the blisters began to heal over. By the second week, his hands looked almost normal again, and though they were still scarred, they were fully functional. He'd never had anyone take care of him in that way, and because he didn't know how to react, he just accepted it. The snow eventually got much deeper, and it was the kind of heavy winter that made the rest of the world feel like a theory that wasn't real anymore. They were alone now, in a way that felt final. She looked out the window one morning and realized she wouldn't be leaving this cabin until the spring thaw. That thought should have terrified her, but it didn't, because a month ago, she had been abandoned in the desert, and now she was anchored to this ridge by her own choice. The difference between those two things felt enormous. She had reorganized his entire kitchen so that his scattered supplies finally made sense, and she preserved food using fermentation and curing methods he had never seen before. She had taken his mess and created a sense of order. In return, he taught her how to handle a rifle and how to read the coming weather in the shape of the clouds. He showed her how to move through the forest without making a sound, and these were skills that should have taken years to learn but were compressed into a few weeks. Then came the night when the sickness finally caught up with her. It started with a fever and chills, and it was the same illness that had nearly killed her in the desert coming back for a second attempt. She was burning up and speaking Japanese in her sleep while her black hair clung to her damp skin. He sat with her through the entire night and never once left her side or closed his eyes. He just watched her hands clench the blankets and listened to her voice crack around words he couldn't understand. When she grabbed his wrist in her fever dreams because she was terrified of something he couldn't see, he didn't pull away. He stayed right there. By the time morning arrived, the fever finally broke and left her weak but alive. She looked up at him and said something in Japanese, and even though he didn't know the words, the tone of gratitude was unmistakable. Spring arrived early that year, and by March the snow began to pull back from the ridge to reveal the earth inch by inch. The streams ran high and violent with the melt, but the roads leading down to town finally became passable again. Akiko was busy cleaning the cabin when she first noticed the horses moving slow up the ridge trail. There were 3 of them carrying men who looked weathered and hard, the kind of men who clearly didn't belong in these mountains. She watched them approach while her hands still clutched the cloth she'd been using to wipe dust from the shelves. One of the riders had a scar across his cheekbone that looked jagged and deep. She knew that scar. Ezra was outside stacking what was left of the winter firewood, and though she didn't call out to him, she watched his face change through the glass. His jaw tightened first before his entire body went still, but it wasn't the calm stillness of a man at peace. It was the silence of something coiled and ready to strike. He recognized them immediately. He came inside without hurrying and moved straight to the rifle hanging above the door, lifting it down like he was handling something sacred. Akiko felt her stomach drop because she hadn't seen him touch that weapon once since the night she first arrived. "Who are they?" She spoke in English, using only 2 or 3 words at a time, but the fear had sharpened her language instincts in a way nothing else could. He didn't offer an answer. He just walked to the window and looked out with his knuckles turning white around the rifle stock. She moved to stand beside him and saw the scar-faced man looking up at the cabin with the smile of someone who had finally found what he'd been hunting. Her face went hot and then instantly cold as the realization hit her. "That's him, the one who, I know, Ezra, he'll stay inside." His voice was flat and final, and he told her not to come out no matter what she heard. She grabbed his arm in a panic and told him no, fearing the man would kill him, but he looked at her for the first time since the riders appeared. What she saw in his eyes wasn't fear, but something much darker that she hadn't seen since the night he admitted to being alone for 3 years. It was the part of him that had brought him to these mountains in the first place, the part that knew exactly how to break things. "I'm telling you to stay inside." The knock came a moment later, and it was hard enough to rattle the door on its hinges. Ezra set the rifle against the wall, took a deep breath, and opened the door to face them. The scar-faced man was grinning, and his name was Harrow. He said he thought they'd find her dead out there, but he certainly didn't expect to find her alive or living with Ezra. Ezra didn't move an inch and told him she wasn't his. Harrow's smile didn't waver because he was clearly enjoying the confrontation, and he told Ezra that wasn't how things worked. He claimed they had paid for her and they were taking her back. "She's not going anywhere with you. That's not a choice you get to make." Akiko moved before she could stop herself, grabbing one of Ezra's hunting knives from the shelf and stepping into the doorway beside him. She held the blade low but visible and told them in steady English that she was going nowhere. Harrow laughed, a hard and sharp sound, and his hand moved toward his holster. Ezra's fist came up fast. The punch caught Harrow flush on the mouth and sent blood exploding across his teeth as he went down hard. One of his knees hit the dirt while his hand was still reaching for his gun. The other 2 men moved to react, but Ezra had the rifle up before they could even clear their leather holsters. He told them she said no. He was saying no, and it was time for them to leave. Harrow wiped the blood from his chin and spat red into the dust, and his eyes changed as the amusement was replaced by something much worse. It was the look of a man who had just made a cold decision about the consequences to come. "You're making a mistake, Ezra. You know who I am, and you know what I can do." Ezra's jaw remained tight, and his scarred hands stayed steady on the rifle as he told Harrow he knew exactly what he was doing. Harrow stood up slowly and mounted his horse without ever taking his eyes off Ezra's face, and his men followed suit. They rode down the ridge, but they didn't have the hurried pace of a retreat. They rode like men who were only leaving temporarily and would certainly be back. At the tree line, Harrow turned in his saddle and his voice carried up the ridge, clear and deliberate. He told them it wasn't over for either of them, and that once word got out he was harboring a runaway, Ezra would be finished. He disappeared into the pines, and only then did Ezra lower the rifle. Ezra closed the door, and the frame rattled against the jamb like it was angry at the intrusion. Akiko was still holding the knife at her side, with the blade pointed toward the floor, and her entire arm was shaking from the adrenaline. He took the knife gently from her hand and set it on the table while her eyes tracked the movement without really focusing. She was looking right through him at something that wasn't there anymore, or perhaps at something that was always going to be there. He comes back. Her voice was a fractured mix of English and Japanese as she said, "He always comes back." Ezra didn't answer because he couldn't, and they both knew she was right. Harrow was not the kind of man to accept the word no from anyone, and he definitely wasn't going to take it from a woman and a man he viewed as a coward hiding in the mountains. This was only the first round of a much longer fight. They stood in the cabin without moving, and the space between them felt different and much smaller than before. It felt as if the walls had shifted closer while they weren't watching. That night, she made tea that was different from her usual medicine, using only chamomile and honey for a quiet night by the fire. They sat facing the flames as the wood crackled and breathed in the hearth. She waited until the tea was cool enough to drink before she spoke slowly, placing each word as carefully as if she were setting stones in a stream. "I'm sorry. I bring danger to you." He turned to look at her, and the firelight caught the line of her jaw and the curve of her cheekbone. After months of living in the cabin, she looked different and far less fragile than the day he'd found her. She was stronger now, but she wasn't armored in the same way he was. "You didn't bring danger." He paused for a long time while his jaw worked around the words he was trying to find. "You brought something else." "What?" He looked back at the fire and told her she made him not alone. She set down her cup, and her small hand reached across the space between them to take his scarred hand, the one he usually kept hidden. She held it carefully, treating the damaged skin like it was something valuable instead of something broken. His weathered palm against her pale skin created a stark contrast that seemed to define their entire relationship. Everything about them was a study in opposites, from his roughness against her refinement to the violence of his past against the grace of her spirit. Outside, the wind moved across the ridge and through the pines with a sound that felt like a warning. It was the world reminding them that what they had built in this cabin was nothing more than borrowed time. They both understood what the arrival of spring really meant for their future. The roads were opening and people were moving again, which meant Harrow would be spreading his poison down in the town. Word would get out eventually, and their choices would become very real, very fast. She squeezed his hand once and then let go, and they sat with their tea in a silence that the fire filled for them. The flames said what they both already knew, which was that the season was changing, and their lives would have to change right along with it. By the time early April arrived, the mountain roads finally became passable again. The heavy snow had vanished from the open trails, leaving only stubborn dark patches that hid in the deep shade of the pines. The sun had regained its teeth, and the air felt warm enough to make you believe that summer might actually find its way to this high country. Akiko stood by the window and looked down at the town of Dust Creek. From this distance, the place looked almost peaceful, appearing like a collection of wooden toys arranged by a child. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimneys, and the main road cut through the center of the valley like a jagged scar on the earth. Ezra moved quietly behind her as he finished packing 2 heavy leather saddlebags with the basics they would need to survive. He'd gathered dried meat, flour, coffee, and a full water skin, moving with a methodical rhythm that suggested he'd been planning this departure while she wasn't looking. "We can leave now," he said, his voice low but steady. "Both of us can go far enough that a man like Harrow will never be able to find us." She turned away from the window to face him. "Or I could stay here, and you could keep me hidden away." "That isn't a life for you," he replied, shaking his head. "That's just a slower way to die." She remained silent for a long time, while her gaze drifted back to the town sitting in the valley below. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded thin and fragile, like paper caught in the wind. "In Japan, I was a daughter. Then I was a bride, and then I was just cargo to be sold to the highest bidder. Here in this place, I don't know what I am." He didn't offer a quick answer because he was weighing what she was truly asking him. This wasn't a question about where they would travel or what they would do for food. She was asking who she would become if they stayed on this mountain, or who she would be if they chose to run. He wondered if either path actually offered her a real choice at all. "Here, you're just Akiko," he said eventually. "That's all you have to be." She walked toward him and reached out to take his hands. Her fingers wrapped around his scarred palms, and she held them between her own as if she were the one protecting him. She spoke a full sentence in Japanese first, the words flowing like a mountain stream before she searched for the English equivalent. "I teach you words, and you teach me how to live, so we teach each other." He nodded slowly as the weight of it settled between them. "We teach each other." They finished packing the small cabin together, though neither of them had much to take from the life they were leaving behind. There was very little worth carrying, as he'd brought nothing but his own shadow up here, and she'd arrived with nothing but a prayer and a silk kimono that was already ruined. Everything they truly owned was intangible, consisting of a private language they'd built and a level of trust that didn't exist on any legal paper. They saddled the horses in the dirt yard, while the ridge remained perfectly quiet around them. Behind them, the cabin sat empty and already looked abandoned, appearing like just another mountain shelter waiting for the next person who needed to disappear from the world. The world stretched out in front of them, looking dangerous and entirely unpredictable. It was a place full of people who wouldn't understand their bond, and men like Harrow who would never stop coming for what they believed they owned. "Are you ready?" he asked. She looked at him, and the expression on her face finally settled into something firm. It wasn't exactly peace or a feeling of certainty, but it was a deep sense of acceptance for whatever was coming next. She gave him a single nod. They rode down the ridge together toward the town and whatever fate was waiting for them in the valley. The danger hadn't vanished, and Harrow was still out there waiting to collect his debt. The world still wouldn't accept a man like him and a woman like her, but they were riding toward it anyway, and this time neither of them had to face it alone. The trail down the mountain begins to narrow as the elevation drops toward the valley floor. High rock walls close in on both sides of the path, and the forest grows thick with tall pines that block out the sun until the world feels like a corridor of deep shadow and broken light. Akiko's horse stays a few lengths ahead of Ezra's, and her dark hair catches the small slivers of sun that manage to filter through the heavy canopy above. Behind them, the high ridge disappears from view, and the town of Dust Creek begins to materialize through the trees. First, the church steeple appears, then the jagged roof lines, and finally the people moving through the dusty streets who have no idea they are coming. When she first arrived on this continent, she was treated as nothing more than cargo or a ledger entry in a contract waiting to be fulfilled. He was a ghost, a man who had removed himself so completely from society that even the people in the town below had stopped looking for him. Now, they are riding toward a future that neither of them originally wanted, but both of them have chosen to embrace anyway. The cost of that choice is already becoming visible in ways they can no longer ignore. Harrow's threats were never empty words, and by tonight the news will spread through every porch and saloon that Ezra is harboring a runaway. The town will say she is under a legal contract, and that he has broken the law intentionally. That distinction matters to the people in the valley because contracts are the only law they respect, and debt is considered a sacred obligation. A man who breaks his word in this country becomes worthless to everyone around him. There is also the looming question of what happens when the world finally meets her face to face. They have to wonder when Harrow will decide his honor demands a violent response, or how many men will show up at their door because Harrow has the gold to pay them. Choosing each other means they are also choosing conflict and a life that may never truly settle into peace. But she is riding down this mountain anyway, and he is riding right beside her. What they built in that lonely cabin wasn't a romance in the way the old stories usually tell it. It wasn't about a single dramatic moment where they realized they cared for one another, but something much smaller and stranger than that. It was the afternoon she tended to his infected hands without asking for permission, and the way he accepted her help without offering an explanation. It was the quiet night she made tea for comfort instead of medicine, and every meal they shared in a silence that didn't feel empty. Every small gesture bridged the gap between their languages, and every day they stayed was a choice to remain when leaving would have been much easier. Some stories like to end with a couple disappearing into a myth or riding off into a perfect sunset. They stay safe because they are no longer part of the real world and its messy problems. This story ends with them riding directly into the real world while knowing exactly what is waiting for them there. They know that their safety is gone, and they understand that every day they spend together is a day they are paying down a debt to the people who believe contracts are more important than human lives. They will face that mountain debt together, and they will teach each other how to survive the fallout. They will keep choosing each other every morning, not because the path is easy, but because the alternative is going back to the cold silence of being alone. That isn't a traditional ending, but rather the beginning of something much harder and more honest. If you want to see how they navigate the trouble that comes next, like when the town finds out the truth or when Harrow finally makes good on his threats, make sure to subscribe. This story is only just starting.